Everything we think we understand about power, dominance, and control in the ancient world quietly collapses under one uncomfortable truth. There was once an empire so vast, so organized, so relentlessly efficient, that it didn't just conquer land, it rewired the way human civilization functioned. Roads stretched across continents like veins carrying life. Laws outlived the men who wrote them. Armies moved with a precision that feels almost modern. And yet, despite its overwhelming dominance, this empire didn't fall in a single dramatic collapse. It eroded, slowly, silently, almost invisibly. Historians have spent centuries trying to explain how something so powerful could dissolve without a final, decisive moment. But the deeper they dig, the stranger the story becomes. Because this wasn't just an empire that ruled the ancient world, it may have reshaped the blueprint of every civilization that followed. At its peak, this empire controlled nearly everything the known world considered valuable, from the cold, mist-covered edges of Britannia to the scorching deserts of North Africa, from the forests of Germania to the fertile lands of the Middle East. Its reach was not just vast, it was absolute. Millions lived under its rule, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, yet all bound by a single system that dictated order across continents. And somehow, against all odds, it worked, not perfectly, not peacefully, but effectively enough to endure for centuries. Imagine standing on one of its roads, not a simple dirt path, but a carefully engineered artery of stone, stretching farther than the eye can see. These roads connected cities, armies, economies, and ideas. They allowed information to travel faster than any previous civilization had ever managed. In a world without modern technology, this network functioned with a precision that feels almost impossible. Messages crossed thousands of kilometers. Legions mobilized in weeks instead of months. Trade flowed like a controlled current. This was not chaos disguised as power. This was structure. But here's where the story begins to fracture. Because empires of this size are not supposed to last. History teaches us that expansion creates instability. The larger a system becomes, the more fragile it should be. Communication breaks down, resources stretch thin, internal conflicts rise. And yet, for generations, this empire defied those rules. It didn't just survive expansion, it thrived on it. It absorbed cultures instead of simply destroying them. It imposed order without completely erasing identity. It was, in many ways, an ancient paradox. Archaeologists have uncovered cities buried beneath modern landscapes, remnants of infrastructure so advanced that parts of it still function today. Aqueducts that carried water across impossible distances. Amphitheaters that could host tens of thousands. Administrative systems that recorded taxes, laws, and populations with meticulous detail. These were not the works of a temporary power. This was something designed to endure. And yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly unstoppable machine, something was changing, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly. Borders became harder to defend. Leadership grew less stable. The same systems that once unified millions began to strain under their own complexity. What had once been strength slowly transformed into vulnerability. Historians debate the causes endlessly. Was it economic collapse? Political corruption? External invasions? Environmental changes? The truth is, none of these explanations feel complete on their own. Because no single event explains how something so dominant could gradually lose its grip on the world it once controlled. And that's the real mystery. Not how the empire rose, but how it unraveled without a clear breaking point. Because when something this powerful fades instead of falls, it forces a far more unsettling question. What if the greatest empire in history wasn't destroyed, but simply reached a limit we still don't fully understand? To understand how an empire of this magnitude could endure for so long, we have to look beyond its armies and its conquests, and into the invisible systems that held it together. Because its true power was not just military dominance, it was control over complexity. This empire functioned less like a kingdom, and more like a living organism, with networks of administration, infrastructure, and communication acting as its nervous system. Every province, every city, every road was part of something far larger than itself. At the heart of this system was an idea that feels strikingly modern: standardization. Laws were not arbitrary, they were codified, recorded, and enforced with a consistency that stretched across continents. Currency was unified, allowing trade to flow without friction. Measurements, taxation, governance, all aligned under a centralized framework. It created predictability in a chaotic world. And predictability, more than brute force, is what allowed millions of people to function within a single empire without constant collapse. But maintaining this level of order required something else: constant energy. Not electricity, not fuel in the modern sense, but human labor, resources, and movement. Armies had to be paid, roads had to be maintained, grain had to be transported across vast distances to feed cities that could no longer sustain themselves. The empire was not static, it was always in motion. And like any system that depends on constant input, it could only survive as long as that flow remained uninterrupted. This is where the first cracks begin to appear. As the empire expanded, the cost of maintaining it grew exponentially. Defending longer borders required more soldiers. Supplying distant regions demanded more infrastructure. The very scale that made the empire powerful also made it increasingly expensive to sustain. It's a paradox that echoes in modern systems. Growth creates strength, but also dependency. Historians and scientists have compared this to what we now call complexity overload. The more interconnected a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. A failure in one region doesn't stay isolated, it ripples outward. A bad harvest in one province affects supply chains across the empire. Political instability in one area weakens military responses in another. The system becomes so tightly woven that it can no longer absorb shocks. And then came the unexpected twist. Evidence suggests that the empire didn't simply weaken, it began to reorganize itself. Power shifted away from centralized control. Local leaders gained influence. Regions that once depended entirely on the empire started adapting to function independently. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a transformation. The empire didn't vanish overnight, it fragmented, almost as if it was dissolving into smaller versions of itself. This challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about history, that great powers fall because they are destroyed. In this case, destruction was only part of the story. The deeper truth is far more unsettling. The systems that once made the empire unstoppable may have also made its decline inevitable. Because when a structure becomes too complex to sustain, it doesn't explode, it unravels. And if that's true, then this empire wasn't an exception to the rules of history. It was the ultimate example of them. But that leads to an even more disturbing realization. What if the same hidden mechanisms that shaped its rise and fall are still shaping the world we live in today? What makes this story truly unsettling is not how distant it feels, but how familiar. Because when we strip away the armor, the banners, the ancient languages, what remains is a system that looks eerily like our own. Vast networks, interconnected economies, complex governance, a constant need for expansion, growth, and stability. The empire may be gone, but its blueprint is everywhere. Modern civilization operates on the same fragile balance. Cities depend on resources transported across continents. Economies rely on systems so intricate that a disruption in one region can trigger consequences across the globe. Information travels faster now, but that speed has only made our systems more tightly bound, more sensitive to disruption. We have built something incredibly powerful, and potentially just as vulnerable. Scientists studying complex systems have noticed a pattern that repeats across history. Biology, and even technology, systems that grow larger and more efficient eventually reach a tipping point. Not because they are attacked from the outside, but because they become too complex to manage from within. Small failures begin to cascade. Stability becomes harder to maintain. And then, almost imperceptibly, the system begins to shift into a new form. This is the deeper implication of that ancient empire. Its fall was not a single moment, it was a process. A slow transition from unity to fragmentation. And in that transition, something extraordinary happened. The collapse gave birth to entirely new civilizations, new identities, new ways of organizing human life. What seemed like an end was also a beginning. But that doesn't make it less terrifying. Because from the perspective of those living through it, There was no clear line between stability and collapse. No warning signal that said, "This is the moment everything changes." Life continued, trade continued, governments continued, until one day, the system they depended on was no longer the same system at all. This forces us to confront a question that goes far beyond history. Are we any different, or are we moving through the same invisible process, unaware of how close we might be to our own transformation? The unsettling truth is that we may not recognize it until it's already happening. Because large systems don't announce their limits, they quietly reach them. And yet, there is something profoundly human in this pattern. Civilizations rise, not just to dominate, but to connect, to build, to push the boundaries of what is possible. And when they fall, they leave behind more than ruins. They leave behind knowledge, ideas, and structures that shape everything that comes after. The empire may have lost control of the ancient world, but it never truly disappeared. It evolved into the foundations of the modern one. So perhaps the real lesson is not about power, or collapse, or even survival. It's about understanding the nature of the systems we create. Because the forces that build civilizations are the same forces that eventually reshape them. We measure history in empires and eras. But beneath it all, something deeper is always at work, quietly determining how long any system can endure. And just like that empire long ago, we may already be part of a story whose ending we cannot yet see.